welcome. I'm Virginia Weaver. I'm the president of Philosophy Club. Thank you for being here. I just want to invite everyone to come to Philosophy Club, which meets Thursdays from noon to 1 in Whitesides 118. This Thursday's meeting is special because our speaker today will be there. If you are a student and you did not get the chance to check in, if you would do that on your way out, we would appreciate it very much. And now Dr. Williams will introduce our speaker. Thank you.
All right, thank you everyone for coming. I'm very excited to have our speaker here today. I met him a number of years ago. I got interested in working in the philosophy of disability for a number of reasons, and we've now worked together in 2 different book projects in some ways dealing with disability. So I'm very excited for him to be here and for you all to sort of see what he brings with his philosophical chops to talking about disability. So now I read you a blurb about him and his credentials. Kevin Timpe is the William H. Jelma Chair in Christian Philosophy at Calvin University. He received his PhD in philosophy from St. Louis University in 2004. His primary research interests range across the metaphysics of free will, philosophy of disability, virtue theory, and philosophical theology. He has published 9 books, including Disability and Inclusive Community, The Routledge Companion to Free Will, Virtues and Their Vices, and Free Will in Philosophical Theology. In addition, he's published over 50 journal articles and book chapters. So join me in welcoming Professor Kevin Timpe for us.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Virginia. It is nice to be here. Asheville is one of my wife's favorite towns to visit in the U.S., and she's mad that I came this time without her. So I'll have to have even more fun, but just pretend like I'm not having fun so that she doesn't get too mad. Tonight, I want to argue that among the demands of justice are the need for all of us collectively to engage in more disability advocacy. But that argument will make more sense when we understand at least some of the historical context of how our country and our culture have historically treated, or perhaps more accurately, mistreated disabled individuals. They've often been the recipient of injustice in virtue of their disabilities, but this isn't just true of our history, it's also true of our present. While the forms of injustice have changed, the fact of injustice hasn't. And so justice demands, I think, that we continue to engage in disability advocacy in the name of justice. So part of what I wanted to do tonight is to get you motivated to go out and either continue disability advocacy or start thinking about doing disability advocacy. Now, before I really get going, a bit of a content warning. Given the topic for tonight's talk is ways in which disabled people have been subject to injustice, I'm going to be talking about, at a few places through the talk tonight, unpleasant things. I'll be discussing, for example, numerous forms of violence against disabled individuals, including sexual assault. I'm going to try not to dwell on those examples, and I'll give you a bit more heads up when we're getting close to what I think is the most unpleasant parts of this. But I wanted to let you know ahead of time, if you need to step away or tune me out for a few minutes or do something else, please do what you need to. 2 initial clarifications also before I begin. The first of these concerns the language that I'm going to be using tonight and already have begun using. In talking about disability, it's common for people to differentiate what they call person-first language and identity-first language. Talking about a person with a disability or adults with autism are instances of person-first language, right, where we lead with facts about the person. It's a way of attempting to, by our language, focus on the person's humanity and individuality rather than just reducing them to the identity of their disability. As theologian John Swinton says, using person-first language puts the focus on the person as opposed to the label. And in general, we think that's a good thing. Many academic disciplines promote person-first language. If any of you are, for instance, education majors Or if I remember right, there's a PT OT major that's got, was that here or was that the, okay. So there's a number of majors where sort of disability comes up, and it's often in those majors told that person-first language is preferable. Contrast this with identity-first language, such as a disabled person or an autistic adult, right? Here, sort of the lead term in the language that we're using is a fact about the person's disability identity rather than a fact about them qua person. It's often said that we shouldn't lead with the disability. But for those of you that have been paying attention, notice that I've almost entirely used identity-first language. It's interesting to me that the majority of disabled adults actually prefer identity-first language. Most deaf individuals, for whom their deafness is not just a fact about their hearing, but about their language and culture, so the capital D deaf, prefer to be called deaf rather than person with a hearing impairment. Approximately 80% of autistic adults prefer to be called just that, autistic, rather than an individual with autism. Here's a quotation from John Sinclair that I'm going to read here in a minute, an autism rights advocate who helped form the Autism Network International, one of the two leading self-advocacy groups for autistics in the United States. Here's what Jim Sinclair says. I can be separated from things that are not part of me, and I'm still the same person. I am usually a person with a purple shirt, but I could be a purple with a blue shirt any day and a person with a yellow shirt the next day, and I would be the same person because my clothing is not part of me. But autism, Sinclair writes, is part of me. It is only when someone has decided the characteristic being referred to as negative that people suddenly want to separate it from the person. And I'm also persuaded by the work of Elizabeth Barnes, a philosopher of disability who will be here in the spring. I would highly recommend you come back to hear Elizabeth. Elizabeth argues for identity-first language as follows, and here I quote, I use disabled people rather than people with disabilities because disabled people mirrors our usage of other terms which pick out minority social groups. For example, we say gay people, not people with gayness. Right? That's a very awkward phrase. It's sometimes suggested that we should say people with disabilities because disabled people suggests that a disability somehow defines the person. But I simply don't think that's true, she writes. Saying that someone is a disabled person doesn't mean that disability defines them any more than saying someone is a gay person means that sexuality defines who they are, right? Or think about an American author versus an author with Americanness or something like that. Finally, a number of scholars who endorse social models of disability oppose person-first language, where they think that the person-first language, talking about a person with a disability, suggests that disability is just a function of individual bodies, and proponents of the social model of disability think that disability is social in nature. It's a mismatch between facts about our bodies and ways in which the culture is willing to accommodate us. So this combination of reason leads me in my scholarly work to use identity-first language for the most part, though I know that's a preference that's not shared by all disabled individuals. Right? So we've got to use some language. I've given you, I think, 4 interlocking reasons why I'm going to use identity-first language. Right? I've got a disabled son. I in no way mean calling him disabled, right, as an insult or to deny his humanity in any sort of way. So the main reason why people, I think, reference or prefer in some context person-first language, hopefully we can all just stipulate is true. We take these to be individuals with value. My second clarification is what I mean by justice. Now here I don't want to commit myself too closely to any particular theory about what justice is. Right? I'm not going to start talking about Rawls or Plato. Doing so would take time and limit the reception of much I want to say to those people that shared that particular theory, right? The more I wed what I want to say to a particular theory about justice, then if you've got a different preferred theory of justice, the less likely you are to be on board with other things. Now, fortunately, I don't think I need to take a stand on the details of the exact nature of justice, as a fairly general view can get, I think, what I want to say. Historically, justice has been understood as the virtue by which we render to everyone what is their due, or as it's sometimes put, giving to others what they deserve. Many of the other virtues, for instance, prudence, temperance, courage, all focus primarily on the individual, right? The temperate person is precisely the person who is disposed towards wanting the right amount of certain kinds of physical bodily desires. But justice isn't just about me. It involves how I treat people and interact with others. Justice, I think, is fundamentally interpersonal, fundamentally social. Justice is about what is due to another member of our community, or indeed the community as a whole, right? So I think that I've got obligations to Calvin College, even if those obligations aren't just towards other members, Calvin University, or even if it's not just towards other members of Calvin University. And what is due is where we get our language of rights. If something is due to you, if I owe you something, then you have a right to that thing that is due you. A human right, then, is a kind of treatment a person is due simply in virtue of their humanity, and I've got an obligation to treat them in certain ways in virtue of their humanness. A civil right is something that is due another person simply in virtue of their being a part of our civic community. And so I've got obligations to treat members of my community perhaps in different ways than I have obligations to treat all of humanity. But we might think that I've got obligations to treat all of humanity certain ways simply because they're human. Right? And that's where we get the idea of justice most broadly, or justice as connected to human rights. Now, understood in this way, we see that all justice is social justice. All justice impacts how we live together in community. Some people don't like the phrase social justice because of the role they think it plays in contemporary partisan political debates. That's not what I mean by social justice. But it's important to see that justice is by its nature social and something we all ought to care about regardless of our particular political affiliation, and even if we don't like other uses of the phrase social justice. The specific demands of justice depend on membership in a particular community, and here tonight the relevant community isn't member of my preferred political party. I also happen to think that we can have obligations towards non-human animals, towards the environment as a whole, to other kinds of entities. But tonight I'm just going to talk about justice as it relates and puts demands on me toward how I treat all other humans. Right? This is a talk on environmental justice. I'd have an even broader category. We could thus talk about how justice obligates us towards people simply in virtue of their being human. Actions like the U.S. drone program that has been underway for at least the past decade are unjust in my view precisely because they fail to treat humans as they deserve to be treated in virtue of their humanity. There were over 500 drone strikes in Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia under President Obama. Approximately 3,500 deaths, with close to a third of those being civilians, and the majority of civilian deaths being children. Again, that was under Obama. There were 19% more U.S. drone strikes in the first 2 years of the Trump presidency than all 8 years of Obama's. An international monitoring group estimates that U.S. drone strikes have killed over 7,500 civilians so far as of January of this year. Now, earlier this year, Trump actually even revoked Obama-initiated requirements that the U.S. government collect and publicize the number of people we kill with our drone program. So a key part of justice is what we owe to others simply in virtue of their humanity, and part of what I think we owe people is not to kill them simply because they happen to be near our predator drones. Given that disabled individuals are equally human, then we have the same demands of justice to them given their humanity, and again we see that justice is inherently communal or social. In her book, The Wrong of Injustice, Marie McCullough captures the core of social justice as seeking to address the, quote, structural and sometimes hard to detect oppression, domination, discrimination that are based on socially salient features, end quote. And this is exactly what we find historically, not just about disability, but about all sorts of other qualities, right? Socially salient features of individuals as well. Disability has been used to oppress, to dominate, to denigrate the lives and value of disabled individuals. McCullough continues that declaring disability a matter of social justice, she writes, is an important act of resistance. And so what I would like all of us to do is to join the resistance. I've actually been listening to a bunch of Star Wars novelizations over the past couple of years in the car. And if you have not listened to Tarkin, which is about General Tarkin, who is in charge of the Death Star in the first Star Wars, well, chronologically first Star Wars, it actually makes the Empire sound like the good people, right? And it sounds like U.S. foreign policy is the Empire, which I find interesting. But join the resistance tonight. Okay. Now, to see how disability has been and is the location for injustice, I want to turn to our country's history. This treatment is going to be part of the talk tonight that's rather unpleasant. This next part of my talk likely isn't going to be particularly uplifting, but I think it's important for us to be aware of this history for at least 3 reasons. First, unlike other oppressive parts of our history, and again, I'm not trying to say that like only the U.S. is bad with disability, right? It's bad lots of places in the world, but I know U.S. history best. It's the place where I grew up, work, and teach, and so I'm going to focus on U.S. history. I'm talking in the U.S. Unlike other oppressive parts of U.S. history, our history of slavery, racism, sexism, many of us aren't taught about the ableist history of our country. You might have learned in high school about the civil rights movement with respect to race, but you probably didn't hear about the civil rights movement with respect to disability in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. But this is, in fact, our history. We're not aware of how our country has repeatedly and intentionally devalued the lives of disabled people and subjected them to injustice. Or if you're not aware of that now, over the next 30 minutes, you'll become a bit more aware of it. I'd encourage you, if you find this interesting, to check out either of these 2 books, which I draw on here, Kim Nielsen's A Disability History of the United States, and then an edited collection, The New Disability History, American Perspectives. Both of these are, I think, well worth reading. I'm going to recommend a bunch of books to you during the course of the night. I can write them down, or you can email me. I'm easy to find. I'm happy to give book recommendations. The second reason for dealing with some of these unpleasant things is that the unpleasantness of our history provides the background for the injustices that still exist, right? Injustice doesn't evaporate overnight. Looking carefully at history can help us see important truths about our present culture. Third, these past injustices can make us angry. I think they ought to make us angry. And I think that anger ought to motivate us to do something. Right? I'm not a Stoic. I'm an Aristotelian. There's a proper motivational force of anger, and sometimes the thing to do when you're confronted with injustice is to get properly angry by it, so you'll go out and do something. So I want to make you angry. I mean that part. For much of its history, the U.S. has used disability as a way of excluding individuals because they're seen as a burden on our country. Laws have often denied them access. This goes way back in our history. In an 1848 report made to the legislature of Massachusetts, Samuel Howe described disabled individuals as, quote, always a burden on the public. Persons of this class are idle, often mischievous. Their dead weights upon the material prosperity of the state. They're even worse than useless. Every such person is like a upas tree that poisons the whole moral atmosphere around him. End quote. That was reporting, not endorsing. Notice that such individuals are singled out because of their apparent economic and moral drain on their community. Such a view isn't isolated and has actually shaped public policy for much of U.S. history. The Immigration Acts of 1882 and 1924 allowed government officials to restrict the immigration of those either who had a disability or were deemed likely to develop a disability. Individuals with intellectual impairment, epilepsy, mental illness were specifically denied entrance into the United States. Steamship countries that brought over people for immigration that were then deemed unfit in virtue of having a disability at their port of entry, the steamship company was often fined up to $1,000 per individual and then had to send the person back to their port of entry. In the early 20th century, immigration officials were told that any mental abnormality whatsoever justifies the statement that an alien is mentally defective, a judgment that was often used to prevent an individual's immigration into the United States. One of the things about talking about the history, sometimes people's motivation is like, oh, right, but that was then, like things are better now. Things are better now, but not like tons better. Trump's administration implemented a new public charge rule that goes into effect next month. The rule aims to deny a visa or green card to immigrants likely to rely on social services. What do you know? People with disabilities are often more likely to rely on various sorts of social services. And so the idea here is that we can deny green cards or immigration to people simply because we think they're likely to be a drain on the public coffers. So send them back. Perhaps not unsurprisingly, these immigration laws that screened for disability in the 20th century resulted in higher deportation rates for individuals from Asia than for Western Europe. Right? Italians in the early 20th century were seen as non-white and were thought especially to be likely to become disabled, and so were often sent back at higher rates than people from France. People from China, especially in the early 20th century, were deported at 3 or 4 times the rates of other countries. Discrimination against disabled individuals is often closely connected with discrimination based on race. The history of IQ tests, for instance, has racist contours. Many disabled individuals already in the country were then deported, even if they were here legally. In the late 19th and first few decades of the 20th centuries, cities from Chicago to San Francisco enacted laws called now the Ugly Laws that prohibited people with visible disabilities or other mutilated or deformed bodies from being out in public. So you could be arrested if you had a physical disability from walking down the street, even if all you're doing is to go buy your groceries. You're mutilated and deformed, and you don't belong in our communities. The 19th and early 20th century saw a dramatic increase in institutions for those with disabilities. If they can't be in public and we can't send them back somewhere else, they've got to go somewhere. Where do we put them? We'll put them in institutions. Economies of scale and concerns about the ease of resident management. Now that's a wonderful bureaucratic phrase, the ease of resident management. came to dominate, leading to even larger facilities that basically amounted to warehousing individuals with disabilities, and these facilities were often referred to as colonies. The number of individuals in such institutions increased by 50% simply between 1950 and 1970. It was widely recognized that the expanding populations in these facilities led to numerous problems. As one state-level administrator wrote at the time, as the worthy cases spill over into the corridors, the already inadequate personnel to resident ratios become impossible, and there is little the staff can do except fold laundry and keep a fire watch. People weren't attempted to be educated. They weren't given proper medical treatment, proper nourishment, right? Little was done to address these problems through much of the 19th, early 20th centuries. In 1960, Burton Platt and Fred Kaplan published a book called Christmas in Purgatory, a photographic essay on mental retardation. Here's a picture of one image from that book, and there were just thousands of individuals in the institution, Willowbrook on Staten Island, often naked, often sitting in their own excrement, hadn't left the room for months at a time, were fed where they were, that documented these deplorable conditions. Reading this book led investigative journalist Geraldo Rivera to write an expose called Willowbrook, the Last Great Disgrace. It focused on the state-supported institution for children with intellectual disabilities in New York. I actually met, about a year and a half ago, I met an individual in Grand Rapids that's lived in Willowbrook for about 7 years. And he was put there by his parent because his parent had been told by the doctors that this is what's best for your child. Right? And then massive overcrowding, malnutrition, the abuse. Willowbrook housed double the population it was designed for. Individuals slept on the floor, had rags for clothes, if any clothes. Here's an image from when Geraldo went to visit. 4 or 5 individuals sitting just on chairs. They knew that Geraldo and the doctor were coming, so they actually put clothes on people, but it still left them in these sorts of conditions. According to Rivera, 100% of all the residents at Willowbrook had hepatitis within 6 months of arrival, in part because the administrators infected them on purpose with hepatitis without their consent, for no benefit to them. It's an analog to the Tuskegee syphilis experiments. What we can do to these people, since they're disabled and they don't have the same value, is use them as means to our own public health, and we don't even have to tell them or their parents. Rivera's reporting led to a rising chorus of voices advocating for institutional reform. Willowbrook eventually closed in 1987. Overcrowding and abusive institutions were not the only problem in the U.S.'s treatment of individuals with disabilities. I'm not giving you all the bad history here, just parts of the bad history. Many thought that individuals with disabilities, especially those with intellectual disabilities, should not reproduce. The state of Indiana first legalized the forced sterilization of individuals with disabilities in 1907. Part of the growing eugenics movement in the United States in the 19-teens and 1920s that then we exported to Germany. And the Third Reich's final solution was based upon U.S. eugenic science from the 1920s. This picture is a sign of the sort that you would often find in public in the United States. There's actually another book that's not in the slide, is Preaching Eugenics. There were early pro-eugenic sermon competitions in the United States where the church would give money to the church whose pastor could give the best Christian defense of eugenic science. This light flashes every 16 seconds. Every 16 seconds, a person is born in the United States. Every 15 seconds, hundreds of your dollars of money goes to the care of persons with bad heredity, such as the insane, feeble-minded criminals and other defectives. Every 7.5 minutes, a high-grade person is born in the United States, will have the ability to creative work and to be fit for leadership. About 4% of all Americans fall within this class, right? Public campaigns for eugenics in the United States that led to the forced sterilization of over 80,000 people in the United States. It's still legal in, I think, about 26 states to forcibly sterilize somebody with a disability. I looked up earlier today. It became illegal in North Carolina to forcibly sterilize somebody simply because they have a disability in. Anybody want to guess? 2003, 16 years ago. Virginia's sterilization law went to the Supreme Court as part of the Buck versus Bell case, in which Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, writing for the majority, upheld that forced sterilization of disabled individuals is constitutional, writing, quote, 3 generations of imbeciles is enough, end quote. More than 30 states would have these laws. And again, I think that it's still legal in 26 states. Prior to moving to Michigan, I lived in Idaho. Still legal in Idaho to forcibly sterilize on the basis of disability, even though it hasn't been done since sometime in the mid-70s, to the best that I can find out. There's a long history in our country, certainly much older and broader than that. Again, we're not unique in this respect, of violence against disabled individuals. Here's the part of the talk that gets the least pleasant, right? In my earlier warning, comes up most now. This violence is manifest in numerous ways, not just the violence that people were forced to confront as part of forced sterilization or abuse in places like Willowbrook. There's also a robust history of interpersonal violence against disabled individuals. The Southern Poverty Law Center refers to violence against disabled people as, quote, the invisible hate crime. And in fact, there's an entire book dedicated to the subject, Mark Shelley's Disability Hate Crimes. Does anybody really hate disabled people? This is also not a pleasant read, by the way. I finished this about 3 weeks ago. Now, Jack Levin, professor emeritus of criminology and sociology at Northeastern University, helped coin the term hate crime back in 1993 in his book, Hate Crimes, The Rising Tide of Bigotry and Bloodshed. Levin has come to regret the phrase hate crime, since many of the things called hate crimes aren't motivated by explicitly hate or malice. They can be caused by indifference or just dehumanization, seeing other people as others, not part of our moral community. Levin prefers the term now bias crime, right, where you could be biased by hate or some other kind of case. Levin writes, for instance, a perpetrator who selects a victim, this is Shelley writing about disability hate crime, in which you target somebody not just who happens to have a disability, but because they have a disability. So here's Shelley writing about disability hate crime, though, of course, the analog is going to be seen on racial hate crimes or hate crimes against other disproportionately marginalized and abused social groups. For instance, a perpetrator who selects a victim because of their disability identity or even their perceived disability identity, right? You could be, hate crime doesn't require you to actually have the status they're attacking you for, but just they think you have that status. A perpetrator who selects a victim because of their disabled identity is committing a bias crime, even if not ostensibly hate even if they don't ostensibly hate disabled people. The mere fact that someone is targeted because of an identity is enough to prove the perpetrator has committed a bias crime. Now, whether or not such crimes are motivated by outright malice, indifference, or simply the belief that disabled lives are less valuable than non-disabled lives, the data here is pretty striking. Here's just one case. And Shelley's book goes through tons of cases. This is a picture of the aftermath of Doug Dawson, a 50-year-old veteran amputee in Spokane, Washington in 2006, who was lit on fire in his wheelchair. And the images of a firefighter sort of sifting through the debris of that. Just before the two people that attacked Dawson lit him on fire, he was refused entry into the local homeless shelter, the Union Gospel Mission, on the grounds that his disability meant he wouldn't be able to do the chore that was required to come in and stay at the mission. A report by and these sorts of crimes are exceedingly common. Right? This is the purpose of Shelley's book. A report by the UK's Equality and Human Rights Commission indicates that disabled people are 4 times more likely to be the victim of crime than non-disabled people. According to a recent analysis of the National Crime Victimization Survey by the U.S. Bureau of Justice, people with disabilities are at least 2.5 times more likely to experience violence than those without a disability. And the report continues, much of that violence is extraordinarily cruel and sadistic, like being lit on fire in your wheelchair. The percentage of crimes against disabled victims involving rape is 30 times higher than the percentage of rape among hate crimes against the non-disabled. 30 times. One study found that 83% of women with developmental disabilities will be raped at least once in their lifetime, and that more than half that number will be raped at least 10 times before they turn 18. 40% of women with an intellectual disability will be raped at least 10 times before they turn 18. Almost 40% of men with developmental disabilities will be raped at least once. 82% of children with learning disabilities, right, a subcategory of disabilities in general, report being bullied at school, twice the level of other children. Now, for all the discussion of violence against people of color in our country by police, some scholars suggest that police violence against disabled individuals is actually more prevalent. As these two photos indicate, disabled people of color are even at higher risk of violence from police than are non-disabled people of color. As Morenike Giwa Anewu, I'm sure I'm getting her name wrong, writes in the introduction to a book called All the Weight of Our Dreams on Living Racialized Autism, we, those of us who exist at the intersection of disability and race, aren't treated as if we are real. Little concern is paid to the innumerable factors present in our lives that impact how we view ourselves in the world, to how we ourselves are viewed by the world, to our strengths, to our needs. This is a grave injustice. Our lives and experiences cannot be splintered or subdivided into neat little categories, disability over here, race over there. We whose lives are greatly impacted by both racial and disability matters deserve to be more than tokens one day and non-existent the next. Something similar is going to be true of disabled individuals who are a member of the LGBT community or immigrants, right? So again, the intersectionality here is lots of places. The 1st of March each year marks what I learned is called the Disability Day of Mourning. They have a website where they collect the names of all the people with disabilities who have been killed by either their parents or legal caregivers every year. This video is the list of names from 2019 up through about 2 years ago when I was putting together this part of the PowerPoint. And so you'll see that it just slides. Name after name after name. The youngest on this list is, I believe, 7 months old. The oldest, 96 years old. Half of parents who kill their disabled children and are convicted serve no jail time. Another study showed that crimes against disabled individuals result in a conviction only 5% of the time, as compared with a conviction rate of 70% of the time against non-disabled individuals. Criminal penalties for crimes against disabled individuals result in softer or more lenient sentences. And all this data, like horrific as it is, probably actually underreports, because the U.S. doesn't actually require us to keep track of hate crimes against disabled individuals. We do on the basis of race, on the basis of sexuality, but not on the basis of disability. These crimes take place against the larger history of social exclusion and marginalization of disability that we've inherited. According to Fraser Nelson, the executive director for the Disability Law Center, people with disabilities are probably the last group for whom we continue to use language that is known to be hurtful and offensive. Even apart from systematic exclusion or violence, people with disabilities are often bullied by their classmates, peers, family members, other adults. This comment by Nelson was prompted by a case a few years ago in Nephi, Utah, in which neighbors put up a sign that reads, "Caution, retards in area," to let a family know that because of their intellectually disabled son, they weren't welcome in their community. Guess what? Free speech, legally protected. So that's the end of the super unpleasant stuff, hopefully. So I hope that it's now sufficiently clear that not only have we treated disabled individuals unjustly, both on an individual and societal level, but the injustice continues. We need to actively work against these patterns in order to treat disabled people as they are due, as they deserve, with the kind of respect, dignity, value they have, I think, simply in virtue of being humans. I had a colleague at a former university that once referred to me as, quote, the chicken of depression, based on this Far Side comic. The bluebird of happiness long absent from his life, Ned is visited by the chicken of depression. And she said, "Kevin, you're the chicken of depression." Maybe I'm the chicken of depression. Apparently, I'm not a very uplifting person to be around all the time. And maybe some of you are thinking that right now based on the last 35 minutes. Some of you are probably now thinking, wow, that was heavy. What can I do? What can we do about it? I don't want to leave you in the pit of your depression that I have now caused. In the last few minutes, I want to give you 6 concrete suggestions that I think we need to collectively take to normalize advocacy in our communities on behalf of disabled individuals, to seek to make our communities, our schools, towns, churches, employers, and country more just, right? So I'm a philosopher. Philosophers aren't usually particularly practical people. Apparently, we're impractical, depressing people. I'm trying to counter that today. Recommendation 1. The first, which I hopefully have helped you start tonight, is just get informed, right? Brief show of hands. How many of you were aware of some of this history prior to coming tonight? Okay. How many of you were aware of that because of a class this semester in which you're learning about some of these things? Oh, really none? Okay, good. You're unusual, right? It is not usually the case. I taught a class on this stuff last January at Calvin, and like 3 of my 30 students had ever heard any of this stuff. There are great books on the topic. In addition to the 2 I recommended earlier, Joseph Shapiro's No Pity, People with Disabilities Forging a New Civil Rights Movements, is an excellent example. If you're not familiar with this documentary, Lives Worth Living, The Great Fight for Disability Rights that PBS did a number of years ago, find a copy. It's really hard to find a copy, though, and YouTube keeps taking the copies down that other people keep putting up there because of copyright laws, but it's worth tracking down through interlibrary loan. Being aware of these past injustices will help make us more aware of those that continue to this day. We can't fix problems that we're not aware of, right? So recommendation 1, learn about the problems that are there. But you're already partway along that one there. Recommendation 2, don't tolerate injustice just because it's common. One of the central foci of Lives Worth Living was the passage of the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. Senator Ted Kennedy referred to the ADA as the Emancipation Proclamation for Persons with Disabilities. Passed in 1990, the ADA extended protection against discrimination on the basis of disability in the private and public sector. No longer, as of 1990, no longer could people be denied employment, public transportation, access to various public goods like restaurants or services simply because they had a disability. At least in theory. This ADA has been on the books 29 years. I like to drive around Grand Rapids and look at stuff. I think I probably know more about the requirements of the ADA with respect to parking lots than anybody else in Grand Rapids. 2 city lots were illegal. One of the city's park and rec's public pools was illegal that I discovered this summer. The mall closest to our house has the right number of accessible parking spots in the parking lot, which is actually unusual, and the legal requirements. And they decided to build a new cheesecake factory. So the 6 months for which they're building the building, they put up a construction fence blocking all but 2 of those spots, so you can't get in the east side of the mall. I went to talk to the manager of the mall. He didn't like my visit. It's just temporary. When's the construction going to be done? Well, probably, another 4 months or so. Here's the deal. Here's the number of the Office of Civil Rights in the U.S. Department of Justice, where you're legally supposed to report violations of the ADA. You can work on finding a workaround, or I can call. Which would you rather do? He fixed it. It took him 2 weeks. Learn the basics of the ADA, insist that it's followed. I hate to admit it, but that picture of the parking lot in which the accessible spot is used to store plowed snow, that's my employer this past February. Don't let our public officials get away with mocking disability. Don't let people get away with using disability as a slur. Demand better of our communities. As King says in his letter from Birmingham jail, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Recommendation 3, pay attention to media representation, our language, our stigma. Too many films, like the film Me Before You, reinforce the narrative that the rational response to acquiring a disability is suicide. That's the major plot point of many, many U.S. films. It's better to be dead than disabled. Think about how terms related to disability, retarded, spaz, are used as insults. When you hear somebody using disability as an insult, call them out on it. Pay attention how easy it is for us to stigmatize disability. After every mass shooting in the U.S., and let's be honest, there's at least one every week, part of the debate is always, did the shooter have autism? And guess what? Individuals with autism are more likely than the non-autistic population to be the recipients of violence, and they are less likely than the non-autistic population to be the perpetrator of violence. Why do we always turn to autism as the explanation? Right? Because they're not like us. They're different. We're looking for a scapegoat other than our culture sucks. In public discussion, autism is often described using the language of an epidemic. What's the disease? What's the cure? It's said that autism should be eradicated. There is no cure for autism. You know how you eradicate autism? Eradicate autistic individuals. It's often described as a threat, an enemy. There's a war on autism, according to our government. Even a Combating Autism Act signed into law by Bush in 2006. Autistics are enemy combatants. In a war, the point is to crush the enemy. What's that rhetoric say about autistic individuals? A New York University Child Study Center autism advocacy campaign included ransom notes from autism. Here's how one of them read: "We have your son. We will make sure he will not be able to care for himself or interact socially as long as he lives. This is only the beginning." Signed, Autism. By an autism advocacy university-related institute. New York Times bestselling author of Healing and Preventing Autism, Dr. Jerry Katzeneld, says that, quote, "Autism as I see it steals the soul from a child. Then, if allowed, relentlessly sucks life's marrow out of the family members one by one." Think of that stigma. Some of you in this room, for all I know, have autism. Right? Think of what it means to hear that rhetoric all throughout our culture. Don't let people get away with it. Recommendation 4, don't fall for what I call the curse of good intentions. You can try to be accommodating and inclusive and fail. This is a famous set of stairs in Robson Square, Vancouver, designed by Arthur Erickson. Initially, when we see something like this, we think it's a good-natured attempt to make an environment accessible to those with mobility impairment. But they're incredibly bad design. They're too narrow for 2 wheelchairs to pass. There's not enough space to turn around on the landings. Imagine you're going up and you get tired. There's no handrail. Imagine you start going too fast going down. There's no handrail. Imagine that your wheel catches on where the step comes into the ramp. Well-intentioned, but good intentions aren't the only thing that matter. I advocate in public schools, and I often encounter teachers that have good intentions for their disabled students. But having good intentions doesn't mean that a teacher is given what that teacher needs to actually provide what the law requires. Good teachers in a bad district can't do what the law requires of them. They try, they're not able to. Ableism, like racism, is systematic in nature. We have to be willing to call to account those systems to point out their injustice, even when the people in them have good intentions. Recommendation 5, disabled people are often better positioned to notice injustices, stigma, and barriers than non-disabled individuals, right? You know when I started paying attention to accessible parking spots and the requirements by the ADA? When our family was given an accessible parking placard. Prior to that, I didn't think about it. It wasn't until he broke a hip in a bicycle accident that my provost at a former university realized the Disability Services office at that university was in the basement of a building that had no elevator. Took him 3 years to notice it. Why? He didn't have a disability. I talked to the students on campus that uses wheelchairs. Do you know? Yeah, we know it's a problem. We've known it since we first came. We often don't notice things that disadvantage us But in part because of the history I've talked about, many of us don't have disabled friends because our communities are structured to make them not parts of our communities. Approximately 20% of the US population has some sort of disability. Think about your friends. Now, this isn't going to be a super neat one because disability is much more likely in the elderly than among children. But 20% of your friends, according to sort of like this overly simplified statistics, might have a disability. Now, the thing is, you might not always notice that. There are invisible disabilities. Somebody can have a disability and even their best friends don't know it, right? This is why you should never go up to somebody using an accessible placard parked in a accessible spot and just say, you don't look disabled, you can't use it. That happens regularly. 3 times I've been told that my son can't be in one of the Carolyn's carts at a store, or the carts that are made for disabled individuals that you can push around rather than sort of pick them up and put them in there. Another parent came up to me and just said, do you know those are for disabled kids? I'm sure she said special need kids. Yeah, I do. You can't use it. Yeah, I can. And I don't owe you an explanation. We need to have more disabled individuals in our lives, more disabled friends. They can help us, right? But they're also valuable in their own right. This is my friend Carlisle. Carlisle was diagnosed as autistic in his mid-30s. One of the things that I've learned over the years from Carlisle, I've learned lots of things from him, but one of the things that I've learned is that people are more willing to listen to me talk about the struggles of autism than Carlisle talk about it. Because he's autistic and he's a threat. And I'm gentler, apparently. That's just messed up. Right? We can't learn from people if they're not part of our lives. Recommendation 6. As you work to advocate for disability justice, know you're going to mess up. Remember, your good intentions don't entail that you succeed. My good intentions don't entail that I'm going to succeed. Learn from your mistakes. Listen to correction. Of course, we have to have the people around us that feel comfortable to be around us to correct us in order for that to happen. See recommendation 5. Don't stop learning. Don't stop speaking out on behalf of those with disabilities. Don't stop advocating for them or for yourself. As Anne McGuire writes in her book, War on Autism, picture of Anne in the cover, advocacy is risky. Yep, but in that respect, it's like virtually everything else worth doing in life. Education, parenting, relationships, travel, all of these things are risky. But in general, we don't let that risk keep us from doing those things. And we shouldn't let it with disability advocacy either. We need to keep doing this. We need to normalize it. We need to make it part of our culture to tolerate these injustices no more with respect to disability than we do with respect to race, sexual orientation, all sorts of other kinds of things, right? We need to be better about justice across the board. Thank you.
All right, now we now have time for questions. So if you have a question, raise your hand and I will point at you and then you will speak and we'll have fun. So give them the hard questions. He likes that, challenging things.
I have this effect on people, right? I just sort of like depress them into silence. I tried to be positive.
Since you've been looking into this so much, are there any areas of the ADA that you have seen that should be amended and improved?
Okay, so the question is, since I've started looking into this, are there areas of the ADA that need to be changed, amended, improved? I'll be honest, I don't know that I'm great at answering that question just because I'm not an expert in the ADA. I mean, I know a fair bit about the ADA, enough to point out that there are at least 4 violations of the ADA on the floor where my office is. Now, getting my administration to respond to those complaints without getting fired, right, is also tricky.
So maybe more
thank God for tenure. They haven't fired me yet. So I don't know like what the ADA, how it needs to be improved. Actually, one of the things I worry about is that there are bills introduced in Congress that haven't been voted on that would actually weaken it. So right now, I can file I have a mild form of dyslexia, which I discovered in high school. I don't think that it's severe enough to amount to a disability. But right now, I can file an ADA complaint against any public institution or public accommodation, public building that I find. Right? And so I've done this numerous times. They want to change the law such that only people with a disability who have been denied equal access to that building can file them. So what I worry about, less than like what needs to be done to the ADA to make it better, I'm sure there are some things, is ways in which the current Congress is seeking to weaken it. There's a big concern for drive-by lawsuits, people like me that go around just find ADA non-compliance and file lawsuits. I can't make money on an ADA lawsuit. If I have a successful lawsuit against a business, then the only damages that are awarded are what it takes to fix that spot and any legal fees I incur if I'm victorious. If I employ a lawyer and lose, I'm out the money, right? So part of the problem is there's this expectation or this perception that there's people like me going around just filing frivolous lawsuits. And it's not clear that the data backs that up, right? But why let data change how we think about this? I'm sure there are things that need to be done, but I'm not sure what they are. Right now, I just want minimum compliance of what's been required for the past 29 years. But I'm sure that there are things that need to be better. One thing that needs to be better is most university websites are non-compliant. Right? There's actually guidelines for what it takes for websites to be accessible for visually impaired individuals. So maybe we need to do sort of strengthen some of those requirements. So maybe there's one suggestion we need to do better, but let's not lose ground.
Oh, that's helpful. It sounds like a lot of it's with the enforcement of it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, when you're the director of public parking for a city like Grand Rapids and you're not aware that multiple of your parking lots have apparently, for their entire history, been non-compliant, it's not surprising that we have, sort of an enforcement problem, because just so many people are unaware of what the requirements are.
Do you think there's any good place to start with trying to help more disabled people in our everyday lives? Yeah.
Are there good places to start? Yeah, I mean, the best thing to do, you're college, or at least many of you, maybe not all of you, are college students here at UNCA. Probably have students with disabilities on campus. And they probably face sort of geographic access problems. They probably face social, access problems. Adults with disabilities are significantly less likely to have a wide range of friends, for instance. I mean, the data, on all these kinds of things. One of the best things you can do is, find people in your own community that have disabilities that might have been excluded and, befriend them. Now, don't just befriend them so you can be I've got my disabled friends, but invest in their lives. Start paying attention to sort of structural access problems, ways in which communities do this. Next time you hear somebody say in response to something that they basically mean that's unbelievable, that's retarded. Wait a second, you're using intellectual disability as a slur. Let's think about that, There's lots of other contexts where we wouldn't do that with other kinds. And so start looking at those things. If you're a teacher, or if you're studying to be a teacher, all teachers should take a class in, I hate the phrase, but it's the legal phrase, special education. Because the default in education classes should always be a disabled child is educated with their non-disabled peers. If you're a teacher and you're part of a school district and you don't have a disabled child in your classroom, it's probably because they're not following the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, also of 1990. So if you want to be a teacher, make sure you take a class in special education so that you can make your class accommodating. Find your, I mean, there's lots of things. Start local. I started disability advocacy because my son was being denied his federally protected education. And then it dawned on me that, like, yeah, that's true of Jameson. It's also true of Jameson's best friend. So I went up to Jameson's best friend's mom and said, guess what? I know some stuff. Bring me to your meeting. And she did. And then my wife, right? So, and when you, right, then just, these things happen grassroots. And you can get some great ideas by watching the Lives Worth Living documentary, right? Disability rights came about because, in many cases, disabled individuals say, I pay my taxes, I should be able to use the bus. If you're not going to let me use the bus, they padlocked themselves to public buses. They chained themselves in Congress, in the hall of the U.S. Capitol, until Congress finally voted on the bill. That's pretty awesome. Find the local disability marches, right, or whatever. Do those sorts of things. I'm sure that you can find local disability advocacy companies or nonprofits here in North Carolina. Volunteer for them. If you're a sociology major and you have to do an internship, right, or a social work major, do those kinds of internships, right? And that's not to say that other internships aren't valuable, but there's a couple suggestions on what you can start doing.
This is kind of a broad question, but what do you have to say in regards to people, or disabled people at positions of power within, like, the government?
Okay.
The one thing I did is some grassroots movement work with the deaf community where I'm from in Washington. And like, it wasn't a big group of people, but we would just stand at the Capitol steps and like try to inform people that came in.
Yeah.
Because we were like, do you guys know how many people like have a position that is disabled to advocate? And like, I honestly don't remember, but it's just so few.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, disability is probably underrepresented in, right, political offices compared to the general population. Gee, wonder why that could be. And it's not to say that every disabled person is going to be sort of a champion of disability rights, right? We don't need to say that just because a person is a member of a particular social group, then that every member of that social group thinks the same way, right? And so you could probably have like disabled individuals that are in positions of power that have like really problematic views about disability. And part of what I've learned over the years is like different parts of the disability community have different views about things, right? Autistic adults do not get along with parents of autistic children very well because many of the things they see parents doing were done to them and they think that they were ineffective. Many autistic adults find ABA therapy to be abusive in how it's performed often. So we can't expect that like everybody to have the same view. But if there is a person in position of power that happens to have it, right, like volunteer for their campaign or, right, take your extra $4 from your latte and give it to their, I mean, just all the kinds of things, right? And again, support the movements that you see. Volunteer at a disability awareness campaign, or something like that. So again, sort of these grassroots movements, I think can sort of, right, so make sure that when you have a class that talks about other kinds of underrepresented groups, can we talk about disability too? Right? You can, one of the things that, if you're a faculty member, don't listen to this. Students often have a lot more power on college campuses than they think they do, right? And so like sometimes faculty members will ask for things and the administration is pretty good at ignoring us, but students can ask for that same thing. Grassroots movement at Calvin a number of years ago before I got there that actually every single one of our dining campuses has multiple vegan options every meal because of student advocacy on the ground, right? So, right, my wife sometimes calls me a shit kicker. Kick some shit, right? Sometimes it needs to be kicked, and right? Do it.
Doesn't using identity first descriptions, or whatever the word was, require knowing the intention of the individual using it? So like you were saying, if I say to my son that you're an autistic child, it's not a slur or an
Yep.
insult. But if
Yep.
somebody, you know, is hateful,
Yep.
it can be used as a slur.
Yeah, sure. And so again, I don't think that we should never use person-first language. I wrote a general audience book in which I used person-first language, but I talked about sort of the issues on both sides. And just as in response to the previous question, not everybody with a disability shares the same view on everything. Right? There are some disabled individuals that prefer person-first language rather than identity-first language. If you know what somebody's preferred language is, right, like it's just common decency to use it. I was explaining to my 9-year-old just earlier this week, alternate pronouns, right? He, she, ze, they. And our 9-year-old was just like, wait, why do we do this? I said, to be respectful of what our friends want. Oh, okay, I'll try. So if I know that somebody really doesn't like identity-first language, I'm not going to insist on it, right? Just because, like, basic courtesy. And so different people have different views. This is one of those, okay, use what you think is best. If somebody corrects you, right, don't get defensive. Right? It's really easy for us to get defensive. I'm listening right now to D'Angelo's book, White Fragility, and one of the things she talks about in there is sort of when you bring up race, right? White folks, again, I'm a white folk, get really defensive. It's easy to get defensive, but we have to resist that. Learn from, yep, okay, sorry, I messed up. Let me try to do better. And so if you know that somebody's prefers person first, right? If someday my son just says, you know, I want you to use person-first language with respect to me, right? I'm going to do it. But when you're using language to capture these broad things, you have to pick some language. And I do think it's interesting that the helping professions, nursing, therapy professions, education, typically tell people to default to person-first language when most disability rights advocates, scholars, and disabled adults prefer person first, right? And one of the reasons I think that is there's also a long history of infantilizing people with disabilities, treating as if they were infants or children. And so I actually think that that's probably part of what's going on in some of these things, right? And again, as the parent of a disabled child, I understand the impulse. So do your best to learn, and it might be complicated. But we just say, oh yeah, okay, sorry. You've helped me learn. I'll try to do better next time. Right? But again, just because you're going to try to do better next time doesn't mean you'll succeed in doing better. So try and succeed to do better next time. There we go.
We have time for one more question. Yeah, in the back.
So it's less of a question and more of a comment about another person's question about like reaching out to researchers on campus related to like reaching out to the greater community in terms of like disability advocacy. There's the Office of Academic Accessibility and also a new student organization called the Disabled Student Union.
Okay.
And that was started by Chloe Evans, so you can reach out to her if you're interested. I don't remember exactly who that was who brought up the question.
Yeah. So if you have an interest and you're a UNCA student, then find Chloe Everett and talk to Chloe. So good, thank you. Most campuses have offices of accessibility or disability concerns, or the language is different. Not all campuses have disability-oriented student groups. So kudos to UNCA.
Quick question.
Announcement, I guess, following Albert. I'm Katie. I'm from the Office of Academic Accessibility. We're in the basement of UNC Library. So if you need us, come talk to us. We'd love to talk to you.
All right, let's thank our speaker.